In this edition of Unscripted, Alet sits down with Nilo Razi Howe, renowned technology investor, executive, entrepreneur, and SOSCON 2020 keynote speaker, and Kristen Lord, president and CEO of IREX, to discuss the organization's dedication to building a more just, prosperous, and inclusive world, and how that mission has taken on added relevance in 2020.
So, Nilo, you very kindly decided that instead of us paying you for that wonderful keynote you gave us, you asked us to waive paying you and instead paying Kristen's organization. So we thought as we spoke, it might be really useful for the company, our company, to understand why and introduce your rationale and thinking and why you're so attached to this organization.
Happy and actually incredibly grateful to have the opportunity to do that. As I said during the keynote, I sort of had a little bit of an odd childhood growing up, and I found out at a very young age that the world is much bigger than I am and that it can change on you overnight. And so you had to work, everyone has an obligation to think about the world that they want to live in, the community that they want to live in, and be purposeful about contributing productively to that however they can. For some people, it's what they do 24/7. It's their job. For others, and that includes me, it's something I've done in addition to my day job. I call it my psychic compensation. It's more important than any other compensation that I've ever made, but it's what keeps me going. And the issue that I've always cared about is social justice and human rights. And it was really interesting. I sort of feel like the universe, when you're doing the right thing, the universe makes it very easy. And so I had been working with another nonprofit called Global Rights, which I'd volunteered with in Cambodia, eventually went on the board, became the chair of the board, and was wrapping that up and trying to figure out what's the next thing I do. And I had actually come across the work that IREX was doing while I was at Global Rights. The thing that has always compelled me about IREX is it's not about going and solving people's problems. It's about investing in communities, investing in people so that they can build the social institutions that they need so that their communities can thrive around concepts that are so important: inclusiveness, diversity, social justice, etc. So I had been admiring IREX from afar, and very coincidentally, a mutual friend introduced Kristen and I and suggested that we have lunch. And I don't know if I mentioned this when I did the keynote, but the way I decide what I do, I love working with really good people to solve hard problems. And the moment I met Kristen, I had this sort of gut intuitive sense about what an amazing leader she was. I already knew the organization, and I knew this was exactly what IREX needed, was the energy, the purpose, the thoughtfulness, and the wisdom that Kristen was going to bring to it. So after that lunch, I was lucky enough that Kristen asked if I would serve on the board, and I think it took me a negative second to say yes to that. So that's how I've gotten involved, and it's really about, like I said, it's finding purpose and doing it in a way that makes sense to your life. And it's just been a thrill to have the opportunity to work with Kristen. And instead of me telling you about IREX, I would love for Kristen to jump in and tell you all about the incredible work and the ability to contribute. The speaking fee is not something every organization lets me do. So I want to thank you. It's incredibly generous and thoughtful of you guys to do it, and it makes such a huge impact for this organization.
Wonderful. How did it start? Tell us the story.
Let me back up for just a second. First, Alet, I really have to say thank you to you for giving us this platform and for showing interest. And of course, I have to thank Nilu. She's so modest. She's not just involved with IREX. She's now our chair because she's an amazing leader. And our board unanimously voted her as chair after serving as vice chair after only being on the board even a couple of years. So I really need to start with a lot of thanks all around. And I'm happy to tell you about IREX. I think you asked me where it all started. It did not start with me. It started more than 50 years ago, actually, at Columbia University. I've been the president and CEO for 5.5 years, so you can see IREX was alive and well long before I showed up on the scene. And basically, we were started at a tense moment in the Cold War in 1968. And the whole idea was that in order to avoid calamity for the entire human race, there had to be much greater understanding in the world. And so IREX became a premier organization, bringing researchers and scholars, teachers and students back and forth between the United States and the entire Soviet bloc. This movement of people and ideas, this understanding that would be generated mutually could actually help to solve problems and really stave off some of the worst consequences of what could have been it was a very troubled time, but it could have been much worse, actually. So those are the roots of the organization. But when the world changed, IREX changed too. So when the Berlin Wall fell down, when the Cold War ended, IREX was this organization that had built up thousands and thousands of people who had gone back and forth over all these decades. IREX was the institution that had this deep understanding of these societies and what they needed. And so, not only big foundations like Carnegie and the Ford Foundation, but the US government turned to IREX to help support these societies and these leaders as they tried to put down the building blocks of democratic societies: independent civil society, independent media, a whole new generation of leaders who were not tied to the former communist government, education reform. And so IREX did that for many years. And I know that this is a technology company. Some of you may be interested to know that many of many people in the former Soviet bloc actually got their access to the internet first through IREX, because we established all kinds of centers to help people learn digital literacy skills and get that connection to the rest of the world that they had lacked. So those are the roots. But if we flash forward to now, IREX has really changed again. It was around the turn of the century that we took that portfolio globally. I would call us a human development organization. We invest in people, we invest in communities, and we do that not so we can swoop in and solve their issues, but rather so that they can address issues in their own communities. And so our mission is to promote more just, more prosperous, more inclusive societies around the world. And our strategy is to do this through four main ways. The first is engaging and empowering youth. And you may know we have the largest youth population in human history on the planet right now. And that can either end very well if we unleash that energy and that potential, or it's a risk if we don't harness that potential and if people are unemployed, marginalized, left out, left behind. The second thing we do is strengthen institutions. We all in our societies need educational, civic, governing institutions that work and that work for people that are intended to work for. And so we work with people to just the raw nuts and bolts of making institutions work better and work in a way that serve their constituents better. The third thing we do is extend access to quality education and information. And we do this in a number of ways. One is training teachers. We train thousands of secondary school teachers around the world to teach people not just to engage in rote learning, but to solve problems, critical thinking, and to work in teams, to communicate cross-culturally, skills we all need. We also do it by supporting independent media outlets and quality journalism, by protecting journalists. And, because of what you do, you may be interested to know that some of what we do is help journalists and human rights defenders learn how to protect their data, their cybersecurity, the security of their sources, because this is one of the ways that these people are really under threat right now. And then in this category, the last thing I'll mention is really giving citizens the tools to consume information critically. The world is awash in misinformation and disinformation. Tech tools are part of the solution, and working with the tech platforms are part of the solution. But in a free society, you will always be behind the ability of bad actors to perpetrate bad information. There's just no way for algorithms to get that good. And then when the cost of producing disinformation is basically zero, it would also be helpful to have citizens who themselves have the software in their own minds to discern what is true and what is false when they are being emotionally manipulated and baited with intent. And so that's another thing that we've done a lot of work on around the world. We're considered a global leader. The last pillar of our strategy is cultivating leaders. But they're actually not people like you, Aled. We don't tend to work with CEOs and presidents and prime ministers. We tend to work with the mayors and the teachers, the human rights activists, the journalists, the people who are really in the grassroots of societies. We really focus on leaders who are really leading not just to serve themselves and their families, nothing wrong with that, but also to ultimately serve others. And so we're really trying to cultivate people who have the capabilities to do that well. It's fine to have good intents and values. We want to cultivate those, but people also have to have the skills to deliver, and leadership is a skill. We want them to be able to use data to inform decision-making in this very complicated world. We need them to know how to be inclusive, to be gender inclusive, to be inclusive of different ethnic, religious, racial groups. And we need them to be able to instill in people the trust we need to get things done in this complex world we're in. So I'll stop there. That's a very, very, very brief overview of IREX, but I'd be happy to answer any questions that you or others might have.
It's quite an extraordinary organization. When I spent some time looking at it and also looking at your background, one of the things that struck me in my research was the concept that you talked about, which is building a just and prosperous and inclusive world. And of course, at the moment in history we're in right now, those three words are so, or should be, so far at the front of our minds. How do you feel about the world as it is and what you can do and what you are doing right now?
Well, it's a disheartening moment, isn't it? I think there was a poll out recently that showed just in our own country, in the United States, a huge percentage of the country feels like the world is on fire. That was the specific quote that was used in the poll. And I think it's hard not to feel that way. I think it's not a surprise. And the reason why those three words, just, prosperous, and inclusive, are all in our mission statement is because we really believe those things have to go together. You can't be truly just unless you're inclusive. If prosperity doesn't extend to all, you can't be just and you can't be inclusive. I mean, these things create the society we want for everyone, not just for a few.
In the midst of this disheartening situation we're in, do you have hope?
I do have some hope, and I'll tell you where I do have the hope. It's that I think people have recognized, whether it's in COVID or the protests that have illuminated for some people, the tremendous racial inequity and injustice that's been going on, that the solution has to happen by government and leaders at the highest level, but it really has to happen in every single community as well. And so I think not only do we have this sort of grand vision of more just, prosperous, and inclusive societies, I think one thing that speaks to me is having an approach that is really investing in the many. There is not one person, this grand man or woman who's going to swoop in and save us all. We have to save ourselves, but we need to help each other. And so this idea of investing in human potential, investing people who want to make a difference but need the skills, the knowledge, the networks, the inspiration to do it, to me, I think that is the right approach. I think it's one we need to extend much more broadly. And I really wish we could galvanize that kind of investment in our society and in communities around the world that we manage to for other issue areas. So it gives me hope to see these people in communities making their own changes and driving their own responses. And to me, that is what will ultimately lead to a better outcome.
And there are people who've been working on this for a very long time. And we see progress around the world in the communities that certainly we've been involved with and tracking metrics. And so it is possible to be on a journey that takes you to a much better place than where you are today. As Kristen said, it does require the people who are focused on it and committed to creating the communities that embrace those values. But there is, and there's a way to do it. So that's the hopeful part of it.
When I looked at your mission statement, if I'm not mistaken, there are 5 bullet points. And one of my reactions, I suppose it was subconscious, was, wow, that's a lot, right? And then I took a step back and I thought to myself as I looked at what you do, that if you're not totally encompassing, if there isn't that sense of holisticness, if that is a word, then solutions can't be raised. Is that fair, Kristen? And the follow-on to that is, where do you feel you've made a difference?
I think it is fair. And I think in my old age, I've become very suspicious of silver bullets. I don't think they exist. Yeah. And I think the search for silver bullets ultimately fails. I can't think of times when it works. And so if you don't really tackle the complexity of issues, you don't get to an answer. So I think that is fair. There are probably two parts of our portfolio I feel are particularly relevant right now. One is this effort to build citizen resilience to disinformation. It is so hard to build trust and to get rid of polarization and find solutions when people can't even agree on basic information, when people are so confused about what to believe that they risk withdrawing altogether. We have hard data on our website, as you'll see, that shows that relatively small investments of time and training can help people not just sort fact from fiction, which is important, and check sources, which is important, but also, recognize the agendas of people who are sharing information and ask questions. Why am I getting this information in my social media feed? Why are they using these words that are trying to evoke these emotions from me? Maybe I should think before I just share this. A shocking percentage of people do not open links before they share them with others. And just getting people to engage in that very basic reflection makes quite a big difference. And so I think that's a part of our portfolio I'll highlight. We call it Learn to Discern, that work. The other thing I think we're just so proud of, I'm so proud of, is the work to invest in leaders. So we support the State Department's Young African Leaders Initiative Mandela Washington Fellows Program. And this is your taxpayer dollars are helping to support about 700 rising leaders from across the continent every year to give them really high-level training to build that network. And I have to tell you, the return on investment is just absolutely unbelievable. The relationships they forge with Americans, it's just something I think we all ought to be proud of. I mean, IRX is proud to implement this program on behalf of the U.S. State Department, but it's America's program. And I think it speaks to the kind of country we are, that we don't just go out there for ourselves. We're making investments in people, and yes, we benefit. We benefit economically, and our security benefits, but we also are really helping to support people who share a certain set of values and are driving their own change. So this is not about handouts. This is about investments in people. I'm really proud of that work.
We as a company are working out who we give money to in a way to support the focus on injustice in society that has occurred in our minds and in reality, so sadly in recent times. We're offering our employees a gift matching service. Why should our employees give to this organization?
We have been working on these issues in 120 countries. Is that right, Kristen? Any donation that comes to IREX has this broad impact around the world, but it's not just around the world. Those learnings also come back to the U.S. So, for example, Kristen was talking about the Learn to Discern program that IREX has. The genesis of that program was in Ukraine, fighting Russian disinformation campaigns. And those learnings we brought back to the U.S. to help the American public understand how Russia conducts its disinformation campaigns and develop programs for school children from a young age to understand how to discern, how to be proactive in how they engage with social media. So, this is an organization that is used to delivering results, that has been at this for a very long time, that has incredible leadership, and also just a broad set of partners around the world. So I would hope that this would be one of the organizations that you would consider as you donate, and the Donate Now button is on the homepage, at the bottom of the homepage of IREX, just to put a public service announcement out there. The impact is palpable. The front page of the website lists all the statistics, the number of teachers we've trained, the number of students, the impact that we've had. Kristen and the entire organization is very metric and outcome driven, and is always challenging the organization to make sure that we can measure the results and not just talk about it in a qualitative way. And I think that's really important, that we capture the learnings and push them as broad as possible. I can tell you that your money will be put to incredibly good use here and will have impact both in the US but around the world, because this is truly a global problem that we're facing. Thank you for doing that, by the way. Taking that the next step and actually doing something about it, encouraging your employees to get involved, again, in however way it works for them. And it doesn't work the same for everyone. Some people volunteer, some people donate, some people go and do this for a living. But all of those matter. And it's really about imagining the community you want to live in and the world that you want to live in, and making sure that however you're putting yourself out there, it's toward that goal.
Thank you for saying that. I mean, we've all witnessed, there's plenty of companies saying the right stuff. Who cares? You got to move from words to action. And even that to me is not enough. And sometimes, I mean, I love the fact that you use accountability so deeply. We're trying to build, what are the metrics that we can either shout to the outside world or to the inside world that as a company, how have we progressed? And how have we progressed, not internally, but how have we helped progress externally? How do you, Kristen, help us understand, how do you use metrics? What can we learn?
Well, I don't want to say that we've completely solved all problems and how to measure social progress, but I mean, I think we've really been thinking hard about how to do this thoughtfully. And one of the major things that we've done is to think not just about measuring the impact on the individual people or institutions we're partnering with, but on what we call the ripple effects, which is how are those people, how are those institutions in turn having an impact on the people they're interacting with on a daily basis over a longer term. You know, that's what we ultimately care about. That's where the impact lies. But it is a relatively new phenomenon in the area we work in to try and measure, you know, what is the impact of leadership development training on actual practices that increase inclusion or on actual practices that increase gender or racial equity. And measuring that is not something that's very well established. And we've been putting some effort and some of our own limited resources into trying to figure that out and share that with others, because how can we tell if what we're doing is moving the needle if we don't do that? But in this field, that wasn't always the instinct. You know, when you hear people telling you what a wonderful and transformative experience you're giving them, people like to take that and put it in the bank, but that's actually not enough. It's not enough to transform individuals. It's about ultimately what they go on to do. And unless we look at those, what we call ripple effects, we're not really delivering on our promise and our potential.
I imagine that you both have at least one favorite IREX story. A moment. And I'm sure that there are more than one. I'm asking this question very slowly so you can think. But are there moments that have really stood out in your mind, perhaps towards the sort of the practical angle, or some person you met, or some moment that was very, I don't know, enlightening or rich to you?
I remember talking to one of the teachers who came on one of the programs we run, and he was from Baluchistan in Pakistan, a province. He had never been outside of Baluchistan, let alone Pakistan, and here he had come to the United States to study modern teaching pedagogies. He told me it completely changed how he was going to teach. No more rote learning, no more standing in front of the classes and lecturing. And he learned so many tools in order to do that, and he was so excited to bring that back to his community. And I heard later that he did. You know, he also was really committed to having girls in his school and the community sending girls to school, but also making sure that they were equal partners in the classroom. You know, there is a tendency, including in the United States, to favor boys in the classroom setting. And so he was saying, not only do I have this personal commitment to girls in my community, I actually have tools about how to make that gender inclusive classroom. And, you know, for me, it's just the way these people can go on and influence lives for years after we have any interaction with them. It's to me, it's emblematic of what you get when you invest in people and you just sort of give them a little bit of a leg up, or some new tools to use, or some new inspiration, a new network of supporters. It's just really transformative, not just for them, but for so many others.
Wonderful. Neela?
One moment that stands out for me is meeting a young female journalist who literally had put her life on the line to fight government disinformation and had to move around because threats on her life, but wasn't going to give up the fight. And her resolve and grit and commitment to the cause of making sure people had the right facts at their fingertip was absolutely inspiring, and feeling as though in some tiny way through, association with IREX, that, we were helping empower that was a truly meaningful moment.
I think one of the things that has attracted me to your organization is this combination of the empowerment of youth, this cultivation of leadership, the fact that education sits as a bedrock in your strategy. And when you combine those three things, what you're really trying to do is lift up society, right, for the future. And your holistic approach speaks volumes. Where do you find it really hard to make a difference? And this creates in you, Dr. Kristen, a real sense of frustration. What frustrates you?
There are so many things. I don't know where to start, but let me speak to my background a little bit. You may know that my role right before I came to IREX was at the U.S. Institute of Peace. Yeah. And I think that violence is one of the factors in the world that just frustrates so many things, empowers so many bad actors, criminals, inspires abuse. It's just, it's really shocking. And then once violence takes hold, it is so hard to make a difference as an insider or an outsider. It really hardens people's hearts in terms of being able to work together to solve problems. It leads to all kinds of pernicious side effects. So I know that's sort of a big thing, but if you want, you can invest in people, you can invest in institutions, and really it's worth doing because there are people in the most violent areas of the world who I know are making a difference, and I've seen it myself, places like Afghanistan or Libya. But it's so hard for them to really produce anything systemic change. Like the fact that they can even persist is incredible, but it's that violent context of violence that just makes everything else harder. So I think if there was one thing I had to point to, that's what I would focus on. And if I had a wish for the country, it was that we would take peace a lot more seriously. And I say that with some trepidation because I think we think that peace is like this really fuzzy daisy chain kind of word. And I wrote my dissertation on the causes of war and worked in national security. So I'm not really coming out of this world, but all of us should want to live in a world with less violence in it, whether it's neighborhoods or countries or regions. And we actually spend very, very little money and very little effort and mind share working on that, but we spend a lot of money on defense. And I'm actually pro national security and pro strong defense. That's my background. But when I look at the imbalance of energy and talent and resources and just mind share and leadership attention that goes to conflict and violence, I think, what if we actually put a quarter of that into trying to create more peaceful societies? Because then the education, the business investment, the leadership, it would have much more fertile soil to grow in, and we would get much better results. And those incredible people would be able to make a much bigger difference. So to me, that's one of those contextual things we just have to deal with if we want a big change in the world.
I did read with interest the fact that you were the acting president and the executive vice president of the United States Institute of Peace, which I believe was congressionally formed, correct?
Yes. Mm-hmm. It's on the National Mall downtown.
Right. And just as you spoke then, you mentioned, you almost insinuated, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, that almost sometimes you can't advocate for peace in totality. And I'll just want to mention this. I read a letter from Dr. Martin Luther King this week. And one of the lines in the letter stood out to me, and it is, to create the kind of tension in society that will help men rise from the dark depths of prejudice and racism to the majestic heights of understanding and brotherhood. And it just made me pause that at some point, if the tension isn't there, and we've seen it, then there is a moment in history where it needs to be there. In your work in peace, where have you seen those moments of tension be best displayed?
Well, I think what I learned is that people who really understand peace in a very pragmatic and practical way, and not sort of a amorphous, naive sort of way, they actually will say it is a fundamental concept that there can be conflict and still be peace.
Yeah.
Humans will have conflict. There is no way around it. The only question is whether that conflict is managed with violence or without violence. And I think one of the things we're seeing in the protests right now is the power of nonviolent protests, because violence gives people an excuse. Violence gives people an excuse to say, oh, I don't have to listen to that. Oh, I don't need to support that because, that's associated with violence. But once the violence is taken away, there is hard research by Erica Chenoweth at Harvard and many others showing that you actually need to have conflict and confrontation, but if it is a peaceful sort, meaning without violence, it doesn't mean it can't be emotive and strong, but it has to be without violence, and that is actually what gets the biggest impact in terms of real social change. And I think Dr. King understood that, but there have been movements around the world that have shown that again and again empirically, that is what makes a difference.
Nilu, as we sort of come to an end of this discussion, which I think we're almost getting going, right? Isn't that always the way? Purposeful living. You've said it a couple of times. And can you just tell us, what do you mean by it? And why is it so important? Because it's obvious, but sometimes I think articulation of it makes sense.
Sure. And I think it applies especially to anyone who's working in the tech sector, because technology is driving so much change today. And to some extent, as you look forward to all the change that's happening as a result of technology, so much of which has been accelerated through the pandemic lockdown. Basically, the transformation of the workforce, the elimination of jobs, the increase in income inequality, access and comfort with technology over time will define the haves and the have-nots in society. And so we have to make sure everyone has equal access to it. And B, anyone who's in the middle of that has an even greater obligation to think about how they're going to give back to the world. And I think we have a tendency, all of us, have a tendency to be a little bit tunnel vision, be very focused on the problems of today, on living our life. And, so many people, life is complicated or just hanging on by a thread, by a fingernail sometimes. But there is this big world around you. And again, that world can change on a dime. So you need to make sure that you're engaged, that you understand what's going on, and you are contributing to making it the world and the community that you want it to be, because one of the positives of technology is everyone has power today. Everyone has the power to speak up, to contribute, to learn, and to be thoughtful about how they engage. So we don't live in from my perspective, the obligation is on everyone, and especially anyone who works in the tech sector, to figure out what their role is going to be. I said it when we first spoke, this has been a time for stunning leadership, and leadership isn't just at the helm of a company. Leadership can happen no matter where you sit in an organization. It can happen in communities. Everyone can be a leader and make a difference. So, it's out there, and it's available to everyone. And I truly hope people embrace that, because there's so much at stake and so many good things at stake. It's worth fighting for.
I think you are absolutely spot on when you talk about the power of the tech community. And for me, the tech community also has privilege, and it must use its privilege wisely, correctly and thoughtfully at this moment. And perhaps, the three of us today must be conscious of saying three words which is Black Lives Matter. And perhaps the turn for me in the last couple of weeks, other than my own shortcomings, my lack of understanding that I haven't read enough, and the amount of reading that I hope I'm going to continue to do, is an understanding right now that Black Lives Matter. Kristen, is there work that you would specifically highlight at this moment that needs to be done and perhaps that you're engaged in at this moment in history?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, of course, the answer is yes, there's so much that has to be done. And, even in our organization, which is dedicated to social justice, we're asking ourselves, we mostly focus internationally and some domestically, but we're actually asking, are we actually doing enough to give leaders the tools to promote racial equity and justice? Where are the cases where we have done that? Well, that's not as much as we would have hoped for. We can point to some examples, but is it enough? Absolutely not. So we're actually going through our own conversation right now about that. And I think all organizations ought to do that. For me, it's really important that we not all just put statements on our website and move on, but rather actually do things and integrate it into our work. The key for me is not what did you do this week, it's what are you doing 6 months from now, a year from now, 2 years from now. And I think also recognizing that actually the kind of injustice we saw with the murder of George Floyd was actually nothing new. And so I think we also have to remember that. In terms of things I think we could do, there are so many and I feel unqualified to speak about them, but let me speak about one that I think we are qualified to speak on. IREX was an organization that was created more than 50 years ago to create understanding. And the way that we did that was to expose people to other perspectives and other worlds. And so we talk about study abroad, we talk about the need for international exchange, but we should have a lot more exchange in our own country. Where are those opportunities for people to be exposed to other perspectives, other communities, to gain that kind of understanding at a personal level? Anyone who's been on an international exchange will tell you it is a life-changing experience. It opens your eyes. It forms a human connection. If someone were to write me a giant check today and say, do whatever you want with it, that's actually what I would do. I think we need to create those opportunities for people in this country to have those eye-opening connections that are infused with humanity. So I think we would be able to get through a lot of the problems we have today if we had that basis, that awakening of shared understanding. And I think the protests have illuminated for a lot of people some things that maybe we all weren't paying enough attention to, but there are so many other dimensions to that. And there's so much more we could do as a foundation for everything else.
Anything to add?
I thought that was great. Look, like I said, everyone has to think about what role they're going to play, and every organization has to think about it. If there aren't clearly articulated metrics to hit to move toward solving this problem and go on the journey toward diversity and inclusiveness, then it's hard to get there. So I think every organization has to really think about how it wants to articulate the goal and the outcome that it's going for to get to a better place in society.
Dr. Kristen, one of the things that Source Labs does is try and promote digital confidence. And it's amazing where confidence is needed digitally and how it's needed. And perhaps when we first started talking about this as a concept, it appeared at first to be quite ethereal and almost, is it consequence? And we started to realize that in many parts of society, it is the interaction. It is the secure method. It is the connection. One of the things that we'd like to offer IREX is the following. We provide tests. We ensure that the experience that you give through a web or a mobile interface is flawless, secure, and has quality. We'd like to offer you our services for free.
Oh, thank you.
There are people in your organization at the front end of that technological moment that our infrastructure, our platform, our tools, our people are at your disposal We're offering this to anybody that is involved in this crusade. And we're delighted to do so. I can't influence this company, nor should I, as to where it spends its money. Our sources should make that decision. They should decide. But one thing we can do is give you that opportunity, and we can talk obviously offline as to how we create that, should that be something that is of value to you. But we'd like to make that offer nevertheless.
Well, that's very generous. Thank you so much. And I know our IT director is going to have a lot of great ideas, and I look forward to creating an opportunity to have that conversation.
Thank you. That's fantastic.
One of my favorite lines from poetry is a line from a poet, Robert Browning. And it says, he says, "A man's reach should exceed his grasp, or what's a heaven for?" A man's reach should exceed his grasp, or what's a heaven for? And it just strikes me that what you're trying to do every day is exceed your grasp, go further in order to make a difference that gets us to as close to a utopic state as we can, because the desire to get there, no matter how hard it is, should never stop. So thank you for being the embodiment, both as an organization and as two humans, of exceeding your grasp to show us a better heaven, no matter what your race, religion, diversity, ethnicity, or anything. Just thank you for the contributions that you're both making. It's a pleasure to be connected to you through friendship and through business.
Thank you so much, Aled.
Thank you.